Hi, this is Elliot Eisenberg, consulting economist, getting you guys caught up on a deep dive, I think, into the housing market's appropriate right now. Things are starting to turn around. I wouldn't say they're spectacular by any stretch of the imagination, but let's go through and discuss where we sit with the housing market. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about the labor market. So if you begin on slide 2, we begin thinking about the labor market and what's going on there. And if you look at slide 3, what you see is this number that was flat for literally 50 years, and then suddenly it spikes up dramatically in about 6 weeks ago. And in the course of the 6 weeks, as that line goes up and then slowly begins to go down, and now it's going down faster and faster. It's starting to really shrink a little bit. We've lost about 30 million jobs. This is an amazing number. It's a staggering number. And this is going to cause unemployment to rise, and it's part of the reason our economy is going to do so poorly. But again, look at that number and see how that curve is starting to flatten out a little bit. We're going to get new numbers pretty soon, and they're going to continue to decline. Then the economy is going to start to open. So we haven't lost all the jobs we're going to lose, but we've certainly lost most of them, and that's very important. We might lose 7 or 8 million more, 6 million more. These are huge numbers, I understand that, but it's still, we've already lost 30, so we're already 80% or 85% of the way there, most likely, barring some really unforeseen circumstance. So the labor market's going to get worse, but not a lot worse. And of course, the federal government is helping a lot here by increasing unemployment insurance and the duration of unemployment and so on. So that's all really good. Now, let's talk about interest rates for a second, because interest rates in housing are really important. And interest rates aren't going to be going anywhere. This is really important to point out. Yes, the economy is cratering and interest rates have fallen, and the central bank has done stuff, and Congress has done stuff, and PPP loans and EIDL loans and central bank loans, and help the state and local governments and junk bond issuing companies and so on. I mean, all kinds of new stuff's going out there, but rates aren't going to go up. Even when the economy begins to improve in the later part of this year and through next year, I'd be really surprised to see much happening with the way of interest rates. I'd be just shocked. And if you see on slide 5, you can see my prognostication is for, under the best of circumstances, interest rates rise by 0.5 point through the end of 2022. It may well rise by nothing. They may well rise by nothing. It really depends on what happens, how it goes, where bottlenecks show up. Is there going to be some inflationary pressures? I really don't think there'll be inflationary pressures. I'd be really surprised if there were. I understand there are a lot of arguments suggesting that they'll come because of the rising deficit and all these sorts of things, increases in the money. I just don't see it. I really don't. I'd be surprised. I hope there is. That would be a really good thing, but it's not really out there. Now that we've cleared up that the housing, that the labor market's deterioration is starting to meaningfully slow, and that interest rates are going to stay where they are for a while, let's look at housing. And the key thing for housing, look here on slide number 7, sentiment is not all that good for home buying. We've looked here, this data goes back to 78, so we've got 40 years of data. We're at the lowest point in 40 years. Now, this survey wasn't done every year way back in the mid to left half of the graph, but you get the idea. This is not a great number. So a lot of people are nervous, a lot of people are afraid, a lot of people are afraid they've lost their job, a lot of people have seen their 401k shrink, a lot of people have seen that their husband or their wife or their brother or sister have lost a job, home equity prices aren't going up all that much, we'll talk about that a little bit later, and they're pulling back, and this is not a great time to buy a home. It isn't a great time to buy a car either. I understand that. Despite that, home buying continues, but we have to understand that in the general scheme of things, this is clearly not a stupendously good time. So if you look at slide number 8, what you see here is existing home sales. They're down about 8% in the month of March. Now we know that April is much worse than March, because in March we were only locked down in our homes for at most half the month, and in many cases just a third of a month. In April, we were locked in our homes the entire month. Now that said, realtors figured out ways to show homes virtually. People began to understood that you had to see a home, it was going to be a virtual tour. In some states, construction was not considered essential, then it became essential. I mean, there was lots of confusion going on early on, but by April time and later in April, we began to habituate to this situation and understand this was the new reality and so on and so forth. So my point is, in April, we're going to see a bigger decline in home sales. The decline's not going to be just 7 or 8%, it's going to be meaningfully more. But there's good news. The good news is if you look at the next slide, first-time mortgage applications, as you can see on this slide, clearly precipitously declined for several weeks along with the labor market. But then they hit bottom and then they begin to go up. So if you look at mortgage purchase applications, they bottomed out several weeks ago at about 35% down from the prior year, when the prior year was pretty good. Last year was a pretty decent year. By now, they're only down 20%. Look, I'm not saying this is going to be a spectacular year for home buying. No, I have no illusions here. But don't extrapolate what you saw those first 3 or 4 weeks when the numbers were absolutely nosediving, and then at the very bottom when they bottomed out. Now they're beginning to improve. This may well not be all that bad a year because we're going to have decent employment growth later on in the year in Q3 and certainly in Q4. So we've probably seen the very bottom already. Again, unless something really awful takes place with coronavirus rebound effects in late in the year, or we just transmit more because we become irresponsible in social distancing or so on. But this is a really important sign to point out. And the other thing that's important to point out on existing home sales is inventories. Inventories are remarkably, remarkably low. This is not 2008, which is in the middle of this graph, when inventories were about 4 million units. Inventories now are closer to 2 million units. We've set records almost every single month, dating back to when this data was collected by the NAR back in the early 80s. We are at remarkably low levels of inventory. This is not the way it was 12 years ago when it was the housing bust. We called it the housing boom and the housing bust, and housing led us into the recession, and it led the globe into a recession. This is very different. This is a market that's inventory starved, and people right now are very reluctant to put their houses on the market because they don't want strangers going through their home, if they live in there, of course. So it's very hard to get inventory. We remain massively inventory starved. So we didn't create too many homes. We didn't have an overhang of homes. Credit's not being made easier to get. On the contrary, credit is now harder to get than it's been because of some of the forbearance issues and extra fees that Fannie and Freddie are putting on if your first payment defaults and all that kind of stuff, which you know more about than I do. But credit's not easy to get. Inventories are very tight. So this is a very different market. Do not think for a minute that this is a replay of 2006, 7, 8, 9. It's not in any shape, way, or form. So we've already looked at what's going on at the existing housing market, and let's change hands and now begin to look at the new market in slide 11. This is Architectural Billing Index. This is more than just home construction. This is all kinds of construction. And you can see the decline being absolutely precipitous. And not surprisingly, we see the next slide, slide number 12, we see that home builders' sentiment has absolutely collapsed as well. And if you compare the collapse now to the collapse to the left of the bar on the far right, there are 3 bars on the far right bar, that decline took literally from beginning to end about 3 years. It went from a high of 70 to a low of about 7 or 8 or whatever it was, right? That took 3 years. This may take 2 or 3 months. This is 12 times or 20 times faster, which means the recession is going to end pretty quickly. It's going to be short because we've had this precipitous decline, and that makes it very different. It's not going to be a 3-year decline. We're not starting it with lots of inventory. We're not starting it with lots of construction activity, which you'll see in a couple of seconds, right? This is a very, very, very different situation than we had it before. Look here. This is existing sales. New sales, I'm sorry. New sales 12 years ago peaked out at 1.4 million. Right now they're at 700,000. They're at half where they were before. Just like existing inventory was at 4 million units and now is at 2 million units. There's absolutely no inventory out there. There may not be many buyers, but there are also no inventory. So the equilibrium price that you're getting between them is normal and fine. So we're not going to see a lot of price erosion. This is really important to keep in mind. And you can see this, more in the next slide. This slide is not comprehensive. It's relatively new, but you can see that the decline was very steep. We went from 100%, of what we would normally have down to 15% in the course of a month, right? From mid-March to mid-April, early April. And then we begin to go up. So just like first-time mortgage apps are going up, new purchases are going up as well a little bit. They're going up because, well, they're new. People want to buy a house that's been untouched by human hands, if you will, or just by builders. I'm kidding, but you get the idea. They want something new, they want something fresh, they want something that they have complete control over and all that sort of stuff. So there's suddenly an interest and appreciation for the fact that new homes bring something really special and different to the table that existing homes don't. So there's a little bit of upswing going on there. How long this lasts, that remains to be seen. But it's not likely to go down again. I think that's my point. The general point is things got very bad very fast. But they don't continue to go bad forever. And there's this beginning to bounce along the bottom of the process. And that's clearly what we're seeing now. We're seeing it in automobile sales, which I didn't talk about, but we'll talk about in a future time. We're seeing it in existing sales with the first-time mortgage apps. We're seeing it here in new home sales that have bottomed out and are going up. This is pretty good news. Again, new homes aren't going to be selling like hotcakes. There's no question. They'll probably pull back a little bit in construction activity and may wait to see what happens later on in the year. Come October, November, I expect to see stronger activity in the new home market. But I may well be surprised. I mean, this is what we're going through now is really unprecedented. And and as a result, it's hard to really know what's going on here, right? This is very difficult. But the point is things have bottomed in many, many cases and are likely to get a little bit better going forward. And the inventory of new homes is also very low. We saw construction activity just a minute ago and sales activity being half what it was. This slide looks at inventory levels. And again, if you look back 10 years ago or so to 2005, 6, 7, you see inventory levels of 550, 575,000 of all the different types of houses in construction. Green is permitted but not started. Blue is started but not finished, and red is finished. If you add them all up, all three types, you're at 575,000. By contrast, right now, we're around 300, 325. Not quite half, but almost half. So no matter how you measure it, new, existing sales, starts, existing sales, inventories are dramatically down. And inventory is starved across the country. We also see that everywhere because again, there's a reluctance to put your house on the market. So I cannot stress enough to you how important it is to remember that this has nothing to do with the recession of 2007, 2008, 2009. This is a completely different thing. In this particular recession that we're in right now, housing is collateral damage like everything else. And as I mentioned earlier, demand has come down, supply has come down, and therefore I don't expect house prices to come down. If you have just decline in demand with increases in supply, like we had 12 years ago, then you see prices really collapsing. But if demand and supply both shrink roughly proportionally the same, you've got a new equilibrium supply and demand, but the prices aren't really changing, right? And that's what I expect to see here. You know, prices may go up 1 or 2%. They may go down nationally 1 or 2%. A lot depends on the local market. Is there a lot of tourism in that market, like Las Vegas, for example, or Hawaii, which is really being hit pretty hard with massive amounts of unemployment increases and so on? Maybe they're going to be hit worse. Maybe Midland, Odessa will be hit very hard because they're a headquarters of energy. A lot of oil drilling is going on there and so on. But if you're a normal garden variety place, you're going to be hit hard, but demand and supply are both going down, and supply wasn't very high to begin with. That's the critical important thing as well. Not only are they going down in equilibrium amounts, but there's no supply out there. In terms of refi activity, enjoy it, don't enjoy it, but it's clearly there. I mean, there's some weird pricing, and the spread between mortgage-backed, between 30-year mortgages and the 10-year treasury is kind of weird. You all know that better than I do here. I'm lecturing to the choir here at that point. But this is certainly there. And the last thing I want to end on, the note I want to end on here, is the improvement our economy gets in Q3, because the recession ends probably the end of Q2. We have March, April, May, June, and we're probably done. Is a lot depends on you and how do you feel about the economy, more importantly, about your personal safety. Are you ready to go out there and party and go to a restaurant and go to a bar and be in tight quarters with people at a football game or a basketball game or a rock concert or a tractor pull or an opera or whatever it is you want to do with all of the parents of all your kids that get together once a week and watch your kids play or something? If you are, it will get better more quickly, assuming the coronavirus doesn't return. If you're more reluctant and leery, as this slide shows, slide number 18, it may take a little bit longer. My point is, all in all, there's lots of reason to be mildly enthusiastic about what's going on, despite unprecedented job losses and unprecedented declines in new construction activity and automobile sales and so on. Don't extrapolate. Understand that things are going to begin to get better and that the worst will be over for the entire economy come the end of June. I really expect Q3 to begin to show some improvement from where we've been. Q1, remember, we had just negative 4% growth. Q2, we're gonna have probably close to 30, but by Q3, we're back up to somewhere around 0 or so. So there's gonna be dramatic decline and then a nice steady improvement as well. I hope I've given you some insights as to what to talk about and how to frame what's going on, in particular as it relates to home building and home sales. I look forward to speaking with you in the not too distant future. Be well and be safe.